this video tutorial, we're going to be giving a second example of going from an ERD to a Microsoft Access database. Specifically, we're going to be using that doctor's office ERD example from previous weeks and turning it into a Microsoft Access database. As a little bonus, I'll also show you a different way that you can set up Microsoft Access to use windows instead of tabs, which might be helpful when working with Access, but it's mostly a personal preference and not something you're going to be tested on. I already discussed the required readings for the week in the previous video, but once again, I'll state that to get the most out of these video tutorials, you should first do the required readings from your textbook and watch the video tutorials and lectures from the previous weeks. The big one to watch in this case, before this one, would be the first Microsoft Access tutorial. I'm going to be going through things a little bit faster in this one, as it is the second example, so do make sure you've watched that first tutorial first. With that said, let's get into it. And you can start by creating a database in Access and following along on your own computer. So make sure you start up Access. You can see up here we already have our ERD, the doctor's office exam. Double-click Access. We're going to have a few options come up. We're going to click the blank database to start a brand new database. We're going to want to name our database. If you wanted to save it somewhere else, you click this button, and then you navigate to where you want to save it. Otherwise, if the default documents location is fine for you, you can just save it there. And we're going to call this one Doctor. Hit Create, and it's created the first table for us, just like before. Close this. Before we get started, there's one extra thing I want to show you. So right now we're in tabbed view, where all our tables come up as tabs, and you've probably seen that in the previous tutorial. Some people prefer more windowed view, where each table is a window instead of a tab, and it is possible to do that in Access. If you want to do that, click on File, go to Options, make sure that you click on Current Database, and you'll see an option here. I'll highlight it. These are your document window options. So right now we have tab documents, but we can also pick overlapping windows. We'll select overlapping windows and hit OK. And it's going to tell us that we have to close and reopen Microsoft Access. So let's do that now. So since I already made that doctor one, it's in my recent list, so I can just open that up. You might get this little bar up here when you're opening some files that you download maybe from OWL or in the My Lab examples. And this is just a warning that you have to click Enable Content before you can actually use the database. That's a security feature, just in case this isn't a database that you trust. In this case, if you're downloading it from OWL or you're downloading it from MyLab, you probably trust it, so hit Enable Content. Otherwise, you aren't really going to be able to view it or interact with it until you hit that Enable Content button. In this case, we don't have any tables or anything because we didn't make anything yet. So we're going to create our first table. And you can see the first difference now. See, now instead of a tab, we actually have windows. This can be helpful to some people because they like to have multiple tables up at once and see the tables. So you can see like maybe where your primary keys or your foreign keys are without having to switch between the tabs. So in this example, we're going to try to do it in the windowed view instead of the tab view. We're going to start by making this nurse entity in our diagram over here into our first table. So we already have a table window up. So we're going to start by adding the primary attribute, or the primary key now. So nurse ID is going to be the name of the field. We're going to give it an auto number type. And we're going to tell Access to make it a primary key by hitting this button. And like I said before, you can also right click and hit primary key. We're now going to put in the last name. That's going to be short text. And we're going to want to change the field size, make it a bit smaller. We can see that it's required, so we're going to make it required in our database. Required, we don't want to allow 0 length. So it's not unique, so we can keep index as no. Next one, which is first name. And you notice I did them in a different order than in the ERD, and that's completely fine. The order has no effect on the database. Usually you keep your primary key first, but that's just sort of a visual thing. Again, this is required, so we're going to make it as yes, and we're going to set no for the length. Next one is the doctor ID, and this is a foreign key. So this is going to be important to keep this the same data type as in doctor. I'm going to assume that's going to be an auto number, so I keep it number here. Remember, we don't want it auto number when it's the foreign key. we want it number here, and then in the actual doctor table, once we make that, it'll be a auto number. And the difference between auto number and number is just that Access automatically fills in the auto number for us. It's still a number type, it's just that Access handles it. Well, the number type over here means that the user entering the data has to handle it. Though we're going to put some restraints on that later. So the doctor ID is required. It's going to be a long integer. Want duplicates, okay, so that's fine. Have hours per week. And this was originally a relationship attribute that got put into the nurses entity. So it's going to be in our nurses table. This is going to be a number. For this one, they might not have a full hour. They might work half an hour. So we probably don't want integer. Instead, we're going to go with, let's say, double. So now they could have decimal hours. And we can change the decimal places. Say we only want like 2 decimal places. Now we'll notice that in the diagram this is not required, so we're going to leave it at not required. And we're going to remove the default value. That way it won't fill it in for zeros if it's not actually in there. We're going to save the table. One way we could do that is just hitting the save button up here. And we're going to type in the table name. In this case it's going to be nurse. Again, you want to use all capitals because that's the standard we're using. So again, with that standard, all of the object entities like nurse, doctor, and test are going to be all in capitals, and the relationship entity is going to be in lowercase. We saved it. You can see now that we have it in our list of tables. We're going to go on and create the next table. You can see that we're in windowed mode. We can have multiple ones up at the same time. Full screen if we wanted. We'll go on and make doctor. It's going to have a doctor ID. We're going to use auto number. And it has to be long integer because that's the foreign key type we're using in the other one. We're going to tell it it's a primary key. Add a last name. First name. Set them both to short text. And now we're going to set the properties. In this case, they're both required. So we're going to say required yes. Allow 0, no. And we can limit the length, maybe to 40. So what the actual length should be is really going to be based on the requirements for your particular use case. So in the assignment, it does have specific requirements that you've gathered from your company. So that's what you should follow for the assignment. But in real life, it would depend on what kind of data you're actually going to be seeing. If there's some kind of name that could be really long, you're going to want to be allowing longer field size. We have the first name, last name. We'll save that. I'm going to call it doctor. We're going to create our next table, which is going to be test. Primary key is test ID. I'm going to make that auto number. Make sure it's primary key. Type name. That was just a short description of the test, so it's going to be short text. It's going to be required. 0 length. So that's all fine. So note that you don't have to set required or unique for the primary key. It already does that once you hit primary key. Array by default has to have no duplicates, and it has to be required since it is the primary key. So you don't have to worry too much about changing the properties for primary keys unless you want to change the format or things like the field size for them. I call this one test. And the last table we have to make is that relationship entity. And it's going to store the doctor ID and the test ID. So these are both foreign keys to the doctor and test tables, and those are stored as numbers. So we're going to make sure these are numbers. And it has a date. So notice what happened here. I typed in the word date, and just like name in our other example, that's a reserved word, so we can't use date here. So instead, we're going to change this, and we'll call it test date. We're going to make the type date required, so I'll set it as required. All that's fine. Save, and we'll call this orders. We're using lowercase because just like in our ER diagram, that is the convention we're using for relationship entities or relationship tables. And now we can start adding some data. Doctor, we'll put in last name of Bob. This guy will be called Bob. This one, Alice. We have 2 doctors, 1 and 2. Nurses. Could be last name will be, let's call Alice Nurse. And for doctor ID, this is where the table or the windowed view comes in. So now we could bring up the other table. Could make it a bit smaller. Close these guys. So we can look at both tables at the same time. So it makes it a little bit easier to compare the two. We can say that Alice Nurse is for Dr. Bob. So hours per week was optional, so maybe we won't fill it in for her. Blogs. First name Joe, so this nurse is going to be called Joe Blogs. We'll assign them to Dr. 2, Alice, and we'll give them some hours per week. 34.56. And remember that because we set that number type to be double, it is allowed to have decimal points. If it was just a long integer, it would only be a whole number. That's good over there. So now we're going to take a look at our orders table. It's a bit smaller. Move these up. Before we fill in orders, we're going to need to have some tests. Wider. Remember, you can make the columns wider by hovering in between and dragging to left and right. So we'll have a test called MRI, CAT scan, and then in the orders table, we can add them in. So we're going to say Dr. Bob, that's 1, test ID 2, and we can give it a date. Dr. 2, Alice, we're also ordered test ID 2, and we're going to give it a date. So now that we have all these data in our database, we have to enforce the relationships. So I'm just going to close everything and save. And we go to the database tools, and click on relationships. And remember, in our relationships window, we have to add the tables we want to show in the relationship window. So we can just select all like that. I use the shift key to select everything and hit add. It adds all our tables. And now we can start adding those relationships. So we'll start up here between nurse and doctor. And we'll go, say we're going to drag the doctor ID foreign key, and we drag it on top of the doctor ID primary key. And we say we want to enforce the referential integrity. We see it says 1 to many. That's good because that's what we have over here. Click create. We have doctor, and we want that to be linked to orders. So we're going to drag the doctor ID and drop it on top of doctor ID over here. Enforce. And we want to drag test ID, the foreign key, and drag it over here and drop it on test ID in the test table. And enforce. And there we go. So it should match our ER diagram. So it's not quite as pretty, but we can see that we have the 1 here, we have the 1 here, we have many here, we got many there, we have many there, got 1 here, we got 1 here, 1 there, and many there, and many there. And once again, this only is showing the cardinality. It doesn't show the participation. So that's it. We have our database created now. We have some data in it, and we're enforcing those references. So for example, in the doctor table, if we wanted, for example, in the nurse table, if we wanted to reference a doctor that didn't exist, like Dr. 6, it wouldn't let us, because it's actually checking the doctor's table to make sure that doctor exists. And that's exactly what we wanted. At this point, this is good. Later on, we'll see some tutorials where we start adding forms, reports, and queries to these databases. If you thought this tutorial was a bit fast, make sure you are watching that first Access tutorial where I go through it much more slowly. That's all I have for you in this tutorial, but it's not the end of the content for this week. You've just watched the extra access example covering the doctor's office database. So the next step for you would be to go on to the Access Forms tutorial. This is where I'll show you how to create a simple database form application using Microsoft Access. Links to all these videos, as always, are available on our OWL course site. So take a break, maybe get a snack, and then follow along with that Forms tutorial. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.